Today is the 12th of August, 2009. We are in Margaretville, New York, at the American Legion Post 216. My name is Wayne Clark. I'm with the New York State Military Museum out of Saratoga Springs, New York. Sir, for the record, would you please state your full name and your date and place of birth, please?
Name is Peter L. Molnar, born August 13th, 1957, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
And did you attend school there?
No, I didn't. I attended school various areas growing up. I grew up in Connecticut and New York State, and then also in Europe. So I went to, up until 6th grade I was in Connecticut, then 7th grade in New York. The 7th grade was last year in Connecticut, and then 8th grade moved to Budapest, Hungary for a year in school, and then 9th through 12th was back in New York in New Rochelle. Was
your father in the military?
No. This was, my moving to Budapest was something my parents thought would be appropriate. My parents came out during the 1956 revolution, and my father was a freedom fighter against the Soviets. So they felt, my mom used to lovingly say that I was made in Hungary but born in the USA. But it was the type of thing where they came out, and I grew up speaking, reading, and writing fluent Hungarian, so they felt that I should know my roots better. So my younger brother and I went back to Hungary for a year in school there, at that time behind the Iron Curtain. And we were actually there in 1968 when the Soviets rolled their tanks into Prague.
What was that like for you as a young man?
It was pretty eye-opening. I was 13 years old, and it was one of those things where we saw a lot of freedoms at that age that we took for granted here in the United States, just non-existent in those other countries. And the fact that there was still so much love and family there with the folks that I lived with and communicated with, you could still feel the tension of this type of lifestyle. My family was Roman Catholic, and I was an altar boy while I was there in a Catholic church, and still religion was very strong, but at the same time freedoms of expression, speech, writing, anything were non-existent. I literally saw one of our neighbors taken away in the middle of the night for singing defamatory songs against the president of the country in his drunken stupor. But they took him away, and I was there for another 6 months, and I never saw him again. So there were several things, and then the big difference for me is this was in the 60s, and I came back to the States after living away for a year. It was sort of a celebrity status because, okay, we were Americans, and my brother and I, and so obviously everyone's wealthy in America, and everybody's celebrity status. But I went to a regular public Hungarian school with all the other Hungarian kids, did the same classes, everything. And when I came back, it was readily apparent to me as I watched on TV people burning the U.S. flag in front of the Capitol steps, thinking that these people don't realize how great they have it here just to be able to do that. And so that was part of the motivation as to why I eventually did go into the military. I tried to understand why my household and my family were so fervently anti-communism, and I studied while I was in college. I was an international affairs major and studied East Europe, USSR as a minor, trying to understand what it was that actually caused people to believe in that ideology, and then also why in the aftermath there were people who actually hated it. And it was good education, and it also reinforced my sense of duty and obligation that, we have it pretty well here, so I think it's appropriate that I go into the military. So that was it. So
right after high school, you went on into college, and where did you go to college?
The first 2 years I went to Westchester Community College. I wasn't sure whether I was college material or not, because no one in my entire family history had ever gone to college. So I was the first one. And the community college wasn't expensive, and it was nearby, and actually I did quite well and got a scholarship, a full ride to George Washington University for my last 2 years. And I was captain of the wrestling team at both campuses, and I had a half athletic scholarship and a half academic scholarship. Academics were not as difficult as I thought they were going to be in college. I had this whole mystique about what college was going to be like. But living in Washington, D.C. During the pro and anti-Shah factions protesting on Pennsylvania Avenue and right through the campus, and being right there in the thick of it was pretty educational too. So while I was in college, I went through the Marine Corps' officer candidate school. There were 2 summers that I went through, one between my sophomore and junior year, and then the other between my junior and senior year. And what was attractive about the program was, even though you went through the 2 summer programs and you graduated and got your degree, you were not obligated to have to go on active duty. You could make a decision at that point whether you wanted to accept your commission as a second lieutenant or not. And the other side of it was that they were the only service that would guarantee me a seat in flight school as long as I made the grades. Whether I became a pilot or not, that was entirely up to my capabilities. But the Air Force, through the academy, wasn't doing that. And the other thing that really shifted things for me towards the Marine Corps was I did, when I was a senior in high school, I did have I was nominated for West Point. So I got the nomination, but I blew my knee out in wrestling, and I couldn't make the slot for the time frame when I was supposed to go in. And once you can't make that, then that slot's gone. So I would have to reapply all over again for the next year. And that's when I really started looking more closely at, I wanted to fly, and in the Army, the only pilots were warrant officers, so the academy graduates didn't do that. So it was something that was really the overriding factor for me. The 2 key things that I wanted to do through the military, which the military was very, very good for me for, was I wanted to see the world, and I wanted to be a pilot. So both of those were accomplished, and the Marine Corps was the conduit for that. And while I was going to school at George Washington, there was still a backlash from the Vietnam era, and I didn't have to take ROTC classes while I was in college. I just did the 6 weeks each summer, but when I came back at the end of the summer, I shaved head and had all the fatigues and everything, and I check into my apartment, the dorm there at the school, and people would ask, why do I want to go overseas and kill babies and do things like that. So really what it helped me to see is that if we are doing our jobs effectively in the military, then those type of things won't happen, and that type of ugly situation won't come about. And I think even in today's era, with what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're seeing that very clearly, that same type of mentality does exist, that as long as there are professional soldiers there, they will do the job effectively and minimize loss of life and property.
Let's go back to flight school. What was that like for you, and whereabouts did you go?
I went to Pensacola down in Florida. That was where beginners was basic flight school, and then you would go on to advanced from there after you graduated basic.
What did you learn at basic?
Basic, well, I had never flown before, so I really didn't have any aerodynamic background. But in all the education in my entire lifetime, that was the most challenging there was. Because on other stuff, I could study a little bit, and I guess I had a God-given talent. I could get by. There, it was very obvious. Either you knew what you had to do or you didn't. And there was no room for error. If you make a mistake, you could kill other people, including yourself. So The other motivator for me is I did not want to go into the infantry pipeline. I didn't want to live in foxholes. I didn't want to do any of that. And no disrespect to those guys, but my focus was I wanted to fly. So it was that was the incentive, because if I did not, if I washed out of flight school, then infantry or artillery or something like that would be the alternate that you'd have to go. Flight school was very challenging and demanding, because you also had your military requirements while you're going through flight school. So you were learning they crammed into a 6-week period a full 2 years worth of aerodynamics, navigation, everything. And you had to make the grades, and then you also had to demonstrate skills. I mean, we did all the things like what they showed on the movie, Officer and a Gentleman, the Dilbert Dunker, all the aviation physiology training, everything. So there was a lot to it that was just beyond just getting the academia down. So we did a lot of flying, and then once you soloed and got your basic completed, then you were given a sheet where about every other week there was a class that was graduating. And it was a very high attrition rate. Our class, when we started out, was 45 guys. By the time we finished, there was only 12 of us. And that was in a 6-month period.
So what kind of aircraft did you train on?
It was called a T-34 Charlie. It was a tandem seat, one behind the other, single engine turboprop. And it was a small fixed wing aircraft, but you could do everything from aerial acrobatics to radar, everything. So there was all sorts of capabilities. Some of the other guys trained on the older models that they still had there with the T-28s, and those were rotary piston engines. But I did the turboprops. It was just luck of the draw. And the way it worked was at the end of your basic, when you were given the sheet, there were 3 options that you could put down in order of preference, and those were the 3 different pipelines that you could go to. It was jets, helicopters, or fixed wing, or they called it maritime. And for the Marine Corps, there were only 2 maritime aircraft that you could fly. One was the KC-130 Hercules, and the other was the OV-10 Bronco. 2 completely different aircraft, 2 completely different missions, but the highest grades tended to go to jets, and then or maritime, because maritime they only had like 12 slots per year, so you really had to do well or be very lucky, and I think I was very lucky because I got maritime. Helicopters were usually the lower grades, and I don't know why that happened, because I think flying helicopter is more challenging than flying an airplane, but the end result was I selected 130s because I wanted to, my ultimate goal was I thought I wanted to become an airline pilot. So this would be my stepping stone towards that. And fortunately, there was an unwritten rule that if you graduated first in your class, you would get your choice of what pipeline you wanted. And that class, I happened to graduate first in my class. There were only 12 of us by that time, so it wasn't, but it was pretty competitive. So, but it was great camaraderie. I mean, I remember I had a pretty difficult time getting the landing pattern down. It's called a delta pattern, and you basically have to you fly over the runway and then you brake, circle, and come back, and you land. Well, there were different procedures at different locations throughout that approach, and my brain wasn't keeping up with what needed to be done, and I was behind the power curve, and all I remember all the time was my instructor yelling at me from the back of the cockpit, even though we had helmets on and we could speak to each other. When he got really angry, he didn't want to scream into the microphone, so he turned the mic off, and you could hear him. It was so loud, screaming at the back of your head, because there was a divider between you and the pilot behind you, but they had the same controls, everything, so they could fly the airplane. And the worst phrase that you could hear when you were in flight school or any type of flight training was, "I've got it." And that means the other guy's taking control of the aircraft. You've completely screwed up. You're not good. if I could, I'd kick you out of the cockpit, just go. But there was a lot of camaraderie, and we helped each other out. I lived in a house with 2 other roommates, and it just so happened that in this house, each one of us wanted a different pipeline, and we each got it. So we were very fortunate. One guy wanted to fly helicopters. The other guy, he looked like the proverbial jet jock, and he wanted to be a jet pilot, and I wanted to fly C-130s. And we actually rolled out, those plastic runners, the mats. Got one of those, painted dotted lines down the middle to make it look like a runway 1836, so that you could just come in, and we, in the middle of the living room, we do our approach to landings and walk through it. And in the middle of the night, because you really had to know your emergency procedures down cold, you break into one of the guy's rooms and flashlights in his eyes and yell at him, "Fire in the cockpit, fire in the cockpit, what are your procedures?" And if the guy didn't get it, there's a bucket of water and chew it. So we helped each other train. There was a lot of incentive. But it was a good time. So I think the overall, with the flying, the last flight that I flew at all was in 1996. And what I never missed the politics of the military, but I really miss the flying with the crew going out on the road and just making the decisions and accomplishing the missions. It was really a great part of my life.
Now, your C-130 training, was that down at Pensacola?
No, after basic, I went to Corpus Christi, Texas for another 6 months or longer. There was another 10 months for advanced flight training, and that was in a Beechcraft King Air. Carries about 8 or 10 people. So it was a twin engine aircraft, another turboprop, and excuse me. We finished up all our advanced training there, and that's when you finished advanced, that's when you got your wings. So and when you were pinned with your wings, that was a big deal. That was the ultimate. Now you are a designated pilot. You're a naval aviator, and so that was the first rung. And then you would go off into whichever aircraft was going to be your specialty. And from there, I first went to Cherry Point, North Carolina. That was my squadron, VMGR 252. And there, the squadron did some initial basic training with me, and there was some simulator work, etc. But then they sent me out for a 6-week crash course in the C-130 with the Air Force in Little Rock, Arkansas. And it was my understanding as I learned more, the reason why I got some of the basic first at our squadron was the Marine Corps has their way of flying the C-130 aircraft, and the Air Force has their way. There are a lot of parallels, but there are some various distinctions. So they really didn't want to have to unlearn you too much when you came back. So when you come back to the squadron as a co-pilot, that's your initial designation. You're a co-pilot, and the MOS for that is 7556. Your ultimate goal is to become an aircraft commander, which is 7557, and in order to do that, you'd have to have at least 1,500 to 2,000 hours of flight time, a bunch of tests and training that you have to go to, and be recommended by your squadron commander to do so. So that's always the goal for everybody. The big challenge is when you have a dozen or so aircraft and so many pilots, there's only so much flight time to go around, and you need to be available at all times. So I was a bachelor, and when I reported for duty at the squadron, the S1 officer was a major, and there were 3 of us who were reporting at the same time, all new second or first lieutenants. And he smiled at us, and he goes, and he points out on the flight line, he says, "I bet you think you're here to fly those things, don't you?" "Yes, sir." And we're all excited. And we says, "Well, you're wrong. For at least the first 6 months that you're going to be here, you're going to fly that DW-9D. And we look at each other and we say, "What the heck's a DW-9D?" He says, "That's a desk with 9 drawers. That's what you're going to be flying." And, I was like, oh my goodness. So I had heard before I got there that the real way to get maximum amount of flight time was if you went on deployment overseas to Okinawa, Japan. And there's a squadron there's a detachment there, VMGR 152, which was a combination of the West Coast C-130 squadron in El Toro, 352, and the East Coast, North Carolina, Cherry Point Squadron. They would send detachments, and that would create 152 there. And I told the major, I said, look, my bags are packed. I just got here. I'm ready to go to Okinawa. He laughed so hard. He said, you've got to be crazy. You know, there's a priority, ranking, everything. Well, I came back from Little Rock 6 weeks later, and all of a sudden I'm on the schedule for a test flight. And I'm like, wow, what's that all about? Well, what had happened was there were three gents who were going to Okinawa. They'd been there for several months. One of them broke his leg, couldn't go. The other one, his wife was expecting and he didn't want to go. And the third one got a promotion and he was being transferred out of the squadron. So now all of a sudden they had 3 slots to fill. And out of the guys that showed up at the time, I was the only one who was a bachelor because this was unaccompanied for 6 months. So I said, I'm ready. So they had to test flight me, and next thing I know, a month and a half later, I'm in Okinawa, Japan, and just flying all over the Pacific. And we went everywhere from Australia all the way on up to South Korea and every place in between. And we had, when I got there, things were really going so well, and I was getting so much flight time, I requested a cross-stat. So that means that at the end of your first 6 months, you can stay another 6 months. And I did that. So by the time I came back, the peers that I had checked in with, I was way ahead of them. And I was one of the first lieutenants to become an aircraft commander, because I had gotten so much flight time and been all over in so many different airfields and so many different countries with different languages and everything, that my experience level was well above my peers. So I was at the level of someone who had been there for a few years already. So it was a lot of it I attribute to luck, you know, being at the right place, right time. But I will say there was one, because one of the questions was what was one of the experiences that stood out. The one experience that stood out was kind of unrelated to the military, but it really was. My mom had come down to visit me at Cherry Point, North Carolina, and she had never seen any of the aircraft that I flew, never knew anything about it or anything, and this was, you know, a couple of years of me being into the military. And she was from New York. She came down and visited, and being Hungarian, she still had that thick Zsa Gabor accent and everything. So she came, and I said, all right, I'm going to give her a tour of one of the aircraft. So I'm walking her out to the flight line, and she stops, and she starts pointing out in the distance at one of the C-130s. And there are tears welling up in her eyes, and she starts crying. She goes, is that what you fly? And I said, yeah, Mom. And I was, 23, 24 at the time. And she says, damn it, 23 years ago I bring you across the Atlantic in my belly and that piece of crap. And I was like, wow, I mean, full circle. And it was just uncanny. But she said that's what, when they were picked up in Austria after they snuck across the Hungarian border during the revolution, they flew them to New York in a C-130. So I said, oh, small thing.
And how long were you with that unit?
Well, on and off, I'd say about 5 years, 6 years. Because by the time, it was about that, because I got off active duty in 1986 and went into the reserves. And when I got off active duty, they were just starting a reserve squadron here in Newburgh, New York, at Stewart Airfield. And a couple of buddies of mine who were now out and flying for airlines called me. They said, you really got to check this out. It's a pretty good deal. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, we have one C-130, and they had a trailer along next to the tarmac, and the trailer was the ops shed, the maintenance shed, the training shed, everything all in one. And it was like a flying club. We got a mission to go to Keflavik, Iceland. You want to go this weekend? Yeah, sure, okay. So I jump in my flight suit, go down there, go fly. And we just did, whatever flights came up, they threw them at us. Then a couple of months later, we got another C-130. It's like, oh wow, more flight time. So it started becoming a lot. And then all of a sudden, we started getting involved with Desert Shield and then Desert Storm. So that changed the focus, and the squadron grew like overnight. I mean, all of a sudden we had 12 aircraft, and it became a full-fledged machine.
Do you want to talk about Desert Shield and Desert Storm?
Yeah, that was kind of mixed feelings. There was a lot going on in my life personally at that time, and it was one of those things where when you sign up for the reserves, you never really anticipate that you're going to get activated. But when I was flying for Desert Shield in the summer of 1990, knowing that there might be the possibility that we might be activated and called into something bigger later on, because I saw it was all happening, and there was so much preparation going on, and we were flying in and out of Bahrain and other areas. There was a lot of staging and positioning going on. So the deal that I made with our squadron, since I only lived an hour and a half away from Newburgh, was, okay, I'll fly all these missions, because at that time my mom was dying of cancer, our baby was just a year old, we were buying a house up here, so there was a lot going on, and we'd only been married for 2 years, so it was still in the newlywed cycle and all these other things. So it was pretty challenging. So I said, all right, during this time frame I'll fly, with the understanding that if we do get activated, I'll remain back as the rear det OIC in charge of the squadron, and this way I won't have to go overseas, and at least I'll be close to the family. Well, unfortunately, that isn't what happened. My flying skills were far more valuable to the squadron rather than staying back as the rear det commander. So what ended up happening is we all got shuffled off. So we all went to Desert Storm, activated, and we were based out of a small Army Corps of Engineer made facility in the middle of the desert. It was less than 15 miles south of the Kuwaiti border. And it was tent city that grew up there, everything. But what was interesting was collaterally the dynamics that were going on here back in this community right here in Margaretville. We moved here in September of '90, and even though we had only been living here for 4 months, in November they notified me, in December I left for Desert Storm. Even though I'd only been here for like 4 months, the local paper wrote an article about me because I was the only one locally who was activated that actually went overseas. There were other people who were activated, but they stayed stateside. So for the next several weeks after I left, our phone didn't stop ringing. People calling, here's my name, here's my number, if you ever need anything. And the other interesting thing was that we live 1.5 miles up the hill from the village here. And in the middle of the winter, we have long driveways. Complete strangers would drive up, plow the driveways, and just drive off. Because I left my wife and 1-year-old daughter in the mountains and not knowing anybody for a 3-hour drive radius. So it was pretty tough, and not knowing when or if I'm coming back. Well, in July, when I did come back 7 months later, the local community knew that I was coming back ahead of time, and that long road going up to our house lined with yellow ribbons the whole way. I cried all the way up the hill. I said, we definitely found our home, and that's the way these people are here. It's just beautiful. So that whole element really reinforced a lifelong decision that this is where we're going to put down our roots. So the Desert Storm part, that was, from my perspective, it was a really, really long military exercise, because we didn't come into direct contact with a lot of enemy fire. I think our biggest threat was from friendly fire and other friendly aircraft we had in the skies, because we dominated the skies. The big challenge that we had, by the time the ground war started in February, we had been flying. I mean, if you got more than 4 hours sleep in a 24-hour period at any given time, you were doing really well, because it wasn't just you had 8 hours, you had 12 on, 12 off, 12 on, 12 off was your schedule. But what happened was the tent city that we were living in was less than 100 yards from the runway itself. So jets, helicopters, 130s, everything taking off and landing 24 hours a day. And then also we had a loudspeaker system on top of a mosque right at the edge of Tent City. And normally at around 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning, you'd have the Scud alerts going off, and saying Saddam firing his Scud missiles at Riyadh over our heads, but debris could fall or whatever it was. And that was kind of humorous. One of the first nights that I was there, desert nights get really, really black, really, really dark. And in our tent with no lights, there's like 8 guys sleeping in there, and we'll have cots, and it's on a wooden floor. You can't see your hand in front of your face, it's so dark. Well, I had just gotten there the day before and still hadn't even unpacked my duffel bag or anything like that. It was like you'd been flying for hours and hours, and you're on the other side of the world, you're kind of drained. So I'm still in the recovery mode, and all of a sudden the Scud sirens go off, and I'm in panic mode. I'm like, what the heck? We did all our nuclear biological training. I said, oh God, this is it. And I could hear the rustling going on in the rest of the tent too. Everybody's looking for either flashlights or their gas masks, or everything, and can't find anything. It's hilarious. Then all of a sudden the tent flap flings wide open, and there's a guy. He comes running in, and he's in full what they call mop gear. He's got all the stuff on and the gas mask and everything, and he starts yelling at us. And we go, get on the roof, get on the roof, right now, right now, right now. And everybody's like, what the hell did he just say? and I'm having thoughts, okay, I'm dying now. This whole thing, all they trained us for, it's happening now, and I'm not prepared. I feel like a moron. And so I just grab whatever I can. I run out of the tent, and there's a bunch of these guys all running around yelling orders, and it's like, and he can't understand a word they're saying. So a couple of us just look at each other and say, we're going to go, we're going to go. And it got to the point after a while, after a few weeks of being there, when the sirens would go off, you just roll over and go to sleep, because it didn't make any difference. And you would think that you might be able to sleep a little bit better during the day because there wouldn't be the sirens. Well, during the daylight hours, every few hours from that mosque, they would say their prayers. And it was pretty brutal. It sounded like someone was beating the crap out of the guy who was on the speaker. La, 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 la. He's just screaming at the top of his lungs, and you can't sleep through that, trust me. So eventually it was just like your sleep patterns really changed, and it got to be interesting. But as far as taking enemy fire or anything like that, the closest to that I ever came was our aircraft. Just because we were at the tail end of a mission, happened to be the first aircraft, fixed-wing aircraft, that landed at Kuwait International after the ground troops took Kuwait back. And what happened was it was an interesting approach, because south of Kuwait International Airfield there were all these oil fields, and the Iraqis, when they were retreating, ignited all the oil fields. So there were plumes of black smoke going thousands of feet into the air. So we knew, there were no approach instruments available at the international airport because it had been bombed out. So we were just going off of GPS to locate where the airfield was, and we knew what the elevation of the ground was, and there weren't really anything any large buildings or anything. So we figured if we go down about 1,000 feet above ground level and fly in that way, we should be okay. Well, ignorance is prevalent in the cockpit. We descend down and we're about 20 miles out of the airfield. And that last 20 miles was probably the most exciting 20 miles of flying I've ever done. Because when we descended down and everything got pitch black dark. So now our flight engineer flips on the thunderstorm lights, they're called, in the cockpit, so everything's lit up and we're flying completely off instrument. So it's like being in a simulator.
Mm-hmm.
So we're flying down to 1,000 feet, and we're flying into where the GPS is showing us where the airfield is. Well, all of a sudden, everything starts roller coastering, rocking, because we didn't take into account what creates all that black smoke. The flames were over 1,000 feet high from the oil fields that were burning, and we're flying right through them. So it was like flying through, all these mines and everything. It was just, and you couldn't climb out of them, because if you got caught in a flame and you're climbing out of it, you're going to blow up the aircraft. And so the best thing to do was just, as fast as we could, get through it,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that the airfield was only so far ahead. But every time you hit a flame, you just almost tried to flip the airplane over. It was just pretty exciting. So that flying that in, and then when we got to Kuwait International, we circled the airfield a couple of times, and there were some ground troops there that we were supposed to pick up for medevac to bring out a couple of injured guys. And that was the other stupid thing. One of the guys who was injured had picked up something he was going to bring home as a souvenir and blew his hand off. So it was just some, like I said, I think we were our own worst enemies there at some points. But when we landed, I made sure we kept 2 of our engines out of the 4 running all the time, because I did not want to get stuck there. There were no support mechanisms, nothing. And what I remember was when we walked off the airplane, I told everybody to put their oxygen masks on, because you could see strands of oil just descending in the air. It was just like thick, and it got out all over the airplane, the screens, everything. It was like a molasses type feeling to it, and I didn't want anybody breathing that stuff in or anything. So they got the people and the equipment on board. We start up the other engines, and we're taxiing down to the end of the runway, and all of a sudden now we get an alert, abort takeoff. A helicopter that had come in was hovering at the other end of the runway, and that was the end that we landed on.
Mm-hmm.
And near the end of the runway, he set off a landmine, and the helicopter recovered, but the downdraft actually set the landmine off. So now they had to sweep the whole runway. And the reality is if we would have landed a few feet shorter, we would have set off the landmine with our aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, we're very lucky. And we held up there for a couple of hours while they swept the runways, and we're starting to run low on fuel, and I'm saying, I don't care, we're going to get out of here, we're not staying here. So we took off, and we took a wide circuit route coming back so that we wouldn't go anywhere near the oil fields, and then made it back to the airfield, and that was pretty much one of the more exciting missions.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause the rest of the time we were just like a aerial refueling for jets, and then eventually helicopters as well. And then once the well, that was another interesting flight, because that was the tail flight that we were coming off of. The night we were flying at night when the 1st Marine Division was coming up the East Coast to take Kuwait, the city. They had the Pan-Arab forces coming in from the west, and they were all merging onto Kuwait City. Well, our mission at that point in time was we were a communications relay.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a small relay team in the back, and they were receiving and then resending communications because it wasn't long enough for line of sight. But we got to listen in to all the communications going on up at the cockpit, because we could hear all the radios in the aircraft. So we're listening to that, and we could hear the politics in motion. The 1st Marine Division, the colonel was giving status positions as he's moving up the East Coast. They're taking Iraqis, a lot of them are just surrendering, and it's really not too much resistance, and they're moving at a really fast clip.
Mhm.
And the communication that I remember most distinctly is when there's communication from the colonel, and he's saying, well, sir, should we raise the flag, the U.S. flag over Kuwait City? And he said, no, do not enter Kuwait City. We're waiting for the Pan-Arab forces, because they wanted this to be the Pan-Arabs taking over their own city. And there's a pause, and then you hear General Schwarzkopf come on. Colonel, do you understand the directive? Do not take Kuwait City. And then there's another long pause, and he says, yes, sir, I do. Should we give it back? They were already at the embassy raising the flag, so they lower the flag, take it down, and they pull out and wait for the Pan-Arab forces. About an hour later come in, they take the city, and they raise their flag, and end of story. But that was pretty humorous. So that was politics in motion.
Okay. And obviously you made it back home, and at what point, that was
That was 91.
91?
Yeah.
Okay. And you stayed in till 2000?
Yeah, I didn't fly with the squadron after 96, but I stayed in until 2000, finished up with the reserves. When we came back, there were a lot of stories about birth defects and other issues with a lot of guys when they came back, or PTSD, all the and I really didn't feel that I had anything like that. I mean, there were a couple of times where a siren, like the fire siren, was exactly like the Scud siren, would go off, and I'd have a jolt, say, oh. I mean, because it's kind of a reflex, but nothing detrimental. And actually, by that point in time, our daughter was approaching 2 years old. She was 2 years at that point, and we really didn't have another child for another 4 more years. We waited to make sure there wasn't anything wrong with me when I came back, was the honest truth. And then our next daughter was born 4 years later, and then after that, another 4 years later, we had another child. But they all came out okay. We were healthy and great. But flying with the squadron started becoming more and more political, and the trainings that we were doing were fun, because we were getting heavily into night vision goggles and flying different missions with those types of capabilities. But I could see that that career path wasn't where I wanted to continue for the rest of my life.
Now as a major, were you company commander, or?
Well, I wasn't a squadron commander. I had the opportunity. As a matter of fact, that was one of the reasons why I gave my resignation when I did. Was there were a couple of carrots that I guess the military dangled. They wanted to. They offered a jump up to full-board colonel and a spot in the Pentagon, because we were doing a lot in Croatia at that time. And at one point I was an intel officer, and I also spoke fluent Hungarian, and that was one of the staging countries that they were using, and that was very valuable to them. And it was supposed to be only for a 6-month stint. And I had recall from when I flew for Desert Shield, and then it turned into Desert Storm, even though we had an agreement that that wasn't the route that I would be going. I said I didn't want to go through that whole ordeal again 10 years later with the family now.
Mhm.
And so that's where I decided to sever the ties. But the memories are great, and
Mhm.
if I had the opportunity to fly again, I'd jump at it in a heartbeat.
Mhm. Now, did you stay in contact with any of the people you served with?
Oh, yeah, yeah. A lot of them are flying for airlines, and I'm a financial planner. A lot of them are clients of mine.
Mhm.
So it worked out really well, and especially in this economy where they need the guidance and the assistance in that arena, and someone who understands their scenarios. And right now, we've landed on the long-term care planning side a very large contract with a lot of military personnel through USAA, and that's going to be very big for us.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Did you attend any reunions at all? Or?
Yes, at the Squadron here, we have one every couple of years down at Stewart.
Mhm.
And the most recent one I attended was 2 years ago. There was one just this past year. I couldn't make it, but 2 years ago I went, and it was remarkable how little number of people I actually knew.
Mhm.
When you have the reunions, you have the core people that are there now with the squadrons, and then a lot of us now old timers
Mhm.
show up, and I laugh because everybody had nicknames and things like that. Mine was Repeat, and it was one of those things where it's remarkable how stories take on lives of their own,
Mhm.
and there's a much bigger person than you really are from these stories, and oh, you're Repeat, I heard about that. It's like, wow, okay, yeah. I think that was sort of like where it went, but not exactly. But yeah, they do grow, the
Mhm.
stories, yeah.
And did you join any veterans organizations?
Yes, I'm a member of the VFW. I'm a life member of both the VFW and this Legion post,
Mhm.
and also Marine Officers Association, Marine Corps League, several of them. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
How do you think your time in the service changed or affected your life?
I think the discipline and sense of accomplishment had a profound impact on who and what I am now.
Mhm.
I see other people in different walks of life who lack a lot of basic disciplines, and I see how it wreaks havoc in their lives. And the military definitely helped, not only from that aspect, but also the accountability that goes along with it.
Mhm.
And that accountability has been, godsend, because it makes all the difference.
Mhm.
Makes all the difference. And then as far as just the experiences, there's no way in civilian life I would have ever been able to afford to fly, to be on every continent in the world and see all the different people. I mean, it's motivated me to travel more than anything else. I see, and then there are places that I've been to that a lot of people go to and pay good money for vacations, and I think I'd never go there. But thank goodness I went through the military, and
Mhm.
I checked that off my list. No, that's not one of the places we're going to go.
Mhm.
So the other nice part is I'm able to introduce my wife to different parts of the world that I've gone to, but when we go together, it's a completely different experience. You're not bivouacking, or you're not in
Mhm.
some barracks or anything like that. It's, now we're doing it in style, so,
Mhm.
so it's nice.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your interview.
Thanks, appreciate it.